I have told no one. That is the sentence I have lived inside for 60 years, not as a secret, exactly, and not as a lie. As a decision I made, the hours after, pulled the vessel of continuing back across the expanse margin, and I watched the last of the long-range telemetry go dark. There were 11 of us left on the command tier by then. We had lost the ascending prow and all 143 souls aboard her, somewhere in the interior. Lost them cleanly. No wreckage. No distress echo. No debris signature on any spectrum we could read. We had received the transmission. We had received the response. And we had turned around and run. 11 survivors from a crossing no one was supposed to make. None of the 11 spoke of it afterward, not even to each other. We scattered when the convoy finally reached the outer Vithani resettlement corridors. The conclave authorities processed us as refugees from the Veshari civil collapse, which we were, which was true, which was also the only story we offered them. They did not press. They had 11,000 Veshari to resettle, and a collapsing resupply chain to manage and very little patience for the difficulties of a single convoy's outer margin route. We signed the intake records. We accepted our colony assignments. We learned to be still. I am the last of the 11. Van died in the third winter of the resettlement quietly, of a lung ailment he had carried since the crossing. Selindre followed him 2 years later. The others went across the decades, one by one, in no particular order, of the ordinary causes that close out lives. Illness, age, a construction accident. One of them in a border skirmish in the Rethani drift that I suspect she invited rather than stumbled into, because she had never quite recovered her steadiness after the expanse. The last of them, Povin Ash, my second navigator, died 4 months ago in a care facility on the 7th colony of Vethani Station, and I sat beside him through the final 3 nights, and he did not speak of the expanse, and neither did I. And when it was over, I went back to my apartment and sat in the dark for a long time. I am 81 years old. I have, my physicians tell me, between 8 months and a year remaining. The same lung ailment that took Torath Ven, slower in me, patient, working methodically through the tissue. I am not frightened of it. I have been waiting for it, truthfully, the way you wait for the resolution of a long and unpleasant chord. What I am frightened of is that the record dies with me. I have spent 4 months arguing with myself about this. I have made the case for silence many times, and the case was always the same. What would it change? The Serath Expanse has been designated uncharted and anomalous in the Galactic Conclave's navigational registry for 400 years. Every mapping body in the known galaxy carries that designation without question. The species who border it, the Kelvari on the spinward edge, the Drassic on the rimward approach, the Ethori whose outer margin brushes the Expanse northern arc. None of them chart it. The corridors around it are negotiated clear. The shipping lanes bend away from it, without apology or explanation, in the same way you walk around a room where someone is sleeping, rather than through it, not because you were told the room was occupied, but because you have simply absorbed, over time, the knowledge that you do not go through that room. That is what I did not understand until we went through it. I should explain what we were and why we were there. The vessel of continuing was the flag vessel of the outer convoy, which was one of 9 convoys that departed the Veshari home system in the 3rd year of the civil collapse. When it became clear to those of us responsible for the outer population clusters that no ceasefire was coming, and the industrial bombardment of the outer ring would eventually consume everything we had built. 9 convoys. Approximately 60,000 Veshari, the largest refugee movement our species had attempted since the founding dispersal. We carried what we could carry: compressed grain stocks, water recyclers, seed banks, the medical archives, the cultural record tablets that the preservationists had spent 18 months selecting from the planetary depositories before the first orbital strikes made access impossible. We did not carry enough of anything. We were never going to carry enough of anything. 60,000 people is a number that exhausts resources in ways that planning documents cannot fully anticipate, and our planning had been compressed into 18 months of increasingly disparate revision as the situation on the home system deteriorated faster than any of the projections had shown. I have spoken to historians in the years since, and they have told me that the pace of the collapse was anomalous even by the standards of Vishari civil conflicts, that there were factors that accelerated the industrial targeting of the outer ring which the early projections had not modeled. I do not find this comforting. It does not change the arithmetic of what we were carrying, or how far it was going to have to stretch. The convoy plan called for a route through the Kelvari Conclave's outer transits, then along the Rathani Drift's southern shipping lane, then outward to the Vethani resettlement corridors, where the Galactic Conclave had provisionally authorized a refugee intake. It was a long route, nearly 8 months of transit under standard drive, but it was charted, permitted, and relatively safe. We had passage agreements from the Kelvari and a provisional escort arrangement with a Drassic patrol fleet that would accompany us through the drift, most contested sections. The Kelvari agreement cost us 3 months of negotiation and the entire medical supply reserve we had intended to hold back for the resettlement phase. I signed the agreement knowing this, and knowing that the reserve's absence would create real difficulties in the new colonies, and knowing that the alternative was attempting the route without clearance, which would have meant attempting it through space, where Kelvari patrol vessels operated, and where an unauthorized convoy of 43 ships, carrying 60,000 civilians, would have been a provocation requiring a response. You sign the agreement you can sign. You write the shortfall into the planning documents, and you adjust the projections, and you move on to the next problem. The agreement spot collapsed at the 5-month mark. I will not rehearse the politics of it. The Kelvari had their own internal difficulties that I did not fully understand at the time, and do not fully understand now. What I know is that the passage authorization we had signed and paid for was suspended by a Kelvari Administrative Council, whose authority to suspend it was questionable at best, and that the suspension was communicated to us through a liaison officer who had the grace to appear embarrassed and the authority to do nothing about it. The Drassic escort arrangement fell apart for reasons that were presented to us as administrative but which smelled, even then, of something more deliberate. A decision made above the escort fleet's command tier that filtered down to us as a series of increasingly apologetic communications and then, finally, as silence. We found ourselves in the outer Kelvari transit zones without clearance to proceed and without the fuel margin to return to our entry point. And the Convoy Council met for 11 hours and emerged with a navigation proposal that no one on the council actually wanted to make, but that the fuel mathematics had forced into the only viable slot, the Serath Expanse. Not through it. We were not suicidal. The proposal was to skirt its eastern margin, a corridor that appeared, on the outer system charts we carried, offer approximately 40 light minutes of navigable space between the Expanse registered anomaly boundary and the Kelvari outer transit zone. 40 light minutes was not comfortable. It was not the kind of corridor you send 60,000 civilians through by choice. The Convoy Council had run the numbers 4 times, and the numbers kept returning the same answer. It was the only corridor we had that did not require either Kelvari authorization we no longer possessed, or a fuel expenditure we could not afford. I authorized the route. I have thought about that authorization on most of the mornings of the 60 years since. Before we entered the margin, I ordered Kethan Vor to run a full-spectrum survey of everything our instruments could read from the corridor's entry point. Kethan Vor was my senior sensor operator. He had held that position since the beginning of the convoy, and had held equivalent positions on 3 Veshari outer margin research expeditions before the collapse. He was not the kind of person who reported what he thought you wanted to hear. He was the kind of person who reported what he found, precisely and completely, without editorial or softening, and then waited for you to tell him what to do about it. I valued this quality more than I can express. His survey report came back in 2 hours. The corridor's navigable space matched the charts in every respect: radiation levels, gravitational gradient, debris field density. The expanse itself was behaving as the designation suggested. Anomalous sensor returns on the inward-facing scan horizon, nothing in the outward-facing survey that would impede convoy movement. He noted one item at the end of the report that he flagged as inconclusive. He said that the expanse inward boundary, the edge of the designated anomaly zone, showed sensor returns that were inconsistent with standard empty sector readings in a way that he could not account for through known environmental factors. He said, the returns did not suggest danger. He said they suggested presence. I asked him what he meant by presence. He said the expanse was occupied, not inhabited, occupied. He meant this as a technical description of what his instruments were telling him, not as a claim about what the instruments were actually detecting. He was being precise, which was what he always was. I noted it in the operational log and authorized entry. We entered the margin corridor at the 43rd hour of the 6th month. Convoy was in reasonable condition. We had lost 2 vessels to mechanical failures in the Calvari zone, and the ascending prow had been reporting intermittent drive irregularities that her engineering team had been unable to fully resolve. The remaining 41 ships were functional, and the population was frightened but alive. And we had managed to maintain cohesion through everything the Calvari collapse had been thrown at us. I felt as we came to the margin, something that was not optimism exactly, but was at least the structural shape of forward motion. We had a route. We had a destination. We had a margin in which to travel. The corridor looked on our instruments exactly as the charts had described it. Navigable space. Background radiation within acceptable parameters. No visible anomalies at the outward-facing scan horizon. The expanse itself was, and I want to be precise here, because this detail mattered, and I have never described it to anyone, not dark. I had expected it to look like a void, like the empty sectors I had seen on other routes, where the absence of stars gives the forward view an honest blankness that your instruments confirm and your eyes accept. The expanse was not like that. It was full, not of ships, not of structures, not of anything that my instruments could resolve into a discrete object, but there was something there. A density to the sensor return that was unlike empty space and unlike charted space. The texture of it, if I can use that word for an instrument reading, was like looking at a deep winter lake through ice that was not quite opaque. You could not see, through it you could not see into it, but you could tell that there was depth on the other side. My senior sensor operator, a young Vesari named Kethan Vor, who had been doing this work for 12 years, and who was not easily shaken, described it to me as feeling like the expanse was occupied, not inhabited, occupied, the way a room is occupied by someone who is not moving. Proceeded carefully. I ordered interval scans on a 4-hour cycle and established a communication system within the convoy except for critical, operational traffic, partly from caution and partly from an instinct I could not have defended rationally, a sense that noise was the wrong approach. Here, the convoy followed the margin corridor at reduced drive. The ascending prow fell in near the rear, drive irregularity, making formation discipline difficult. And I noted this and filed it in the operational log and moved on to the next item, is what command requires you to do. At the 27th hour, Kethan Vor came to me at the command station. He did not speak immediately. He sat in the secondary observer position, which is adjacent to the command station, and which is used for exactly this kind of conversation. Private, quiet, something that does not need to cross the open command tier. He organized his data tablet for longer than the organization required, told me that whatever he was about to say was something he had been working up to for some time, and had not yet found the shape for. "Commander," he said finally, "we are receiving a signal." I asked him to describe it. "It is on a broadband frequency," he said. "It is not tight beam. It is not coded in any protocol I recognize from the standard communication library, or from any of the supplementary archives I have access to. It is structured. I want to be precise. It is not noise and it is not environmental. It is a constructed signal. Someone made it." I asked him when it had started. He said he didn't know. He said it was possible it had been broadcasting since before we entered the margin corridor, and that our signal monitoring algorithms had been filtering it as background because it didn't match any known format. He had only caught it because he had been running a manual scan sweep, something he did periodically, not because protocol required it, but because he had a habit of not entirely trusting his own automated systems. He had been doing the manual sweep, and the signal had resolved out of what the automated filter was filing as static, and once he had seen it, he could not unsee it. I asked him what it sounded like. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It sounds like a record. Not a message being sent to someone, a record being kept for someone. The way an archive sounds different from a letter. I asked him if he could tell what it was a record of. Not the content, he said. The format. It has the structure of a formal administrative transmission. The kind of thing a government body sends to a designated counterpart. A report. A status update. But it is very old and it is still cycling. Still repeating on the same interval. It is not degraded. It is not stopped. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked him if he had been able to identify the language or the encoding. He said he had not been able to identify it from any vessel-level archive. He had flagged it to the convoy's communications officer, and the communications officer had attempted 4 standard decryption approaches and had not been able to open it, and had then attempted a broader heuristic analysis which had identified the signal's base encoding as a format used by an extinct civilization, the Serath Collective, whose recorded transmissions existed in the Galactic Conclave's historical archive, but whose language had never been fully translated because there had not been enough surviving material to complete the translation work. He paused. Then he said, "Commander, the Serath Collective is supposed to be extinct. I knew this. Every navigational briefing I had ever received about the Expanse included a footnote to the effect that the Serath Collective had been the Expanse, indigenous civilization, had declined and died out approximately 400 years ago, and that the Expanse had been designated uncharted in the aftermath of that extinction. A standard conclave procedure for dead sectors. The notation was routine. Dead sectors were not unusual. The galaxy had many of them. I asked Kethan Vor whether the signal could be a historical relic, an old transmission still looping from infrastructure that had survived the civilization's collapse. He said it was possible. He said it was also possible that the signal was not old. He said, the quality of the encoding and the preservation of the signal structure were inconsistent with 400 years of independent cycling. He said that signals left to cycle without maintenance degraded in specific predictable ways over time, and that what he was hearing did not show those patterns of degradation. He said it was either extremely well preserved by circumstances he could not account for, or it had been maintained, kept alive by someone, running. I thanked him and asked him to continue monitoring it, and to bring me any change in the signal's character immediately. He nodded and stood. He was at the edge of the command tier when I told him to keep this to the command tier only, not the convoy-wide network, not the other vessels, not the passenger population. He understood why without my explaining it. He went back to his station, spent the next 6 hours at the command station, doing the work that the convoy required of me, fuel allocation reviews, population welfare reports, the ongoing medical situation on 3 of the vessels that had been dealing with a respiratory illness spreading through their transit quarters, and underneath all of it, underneath every data tablet I signed, and every communication I reviewed, and every decision I was asked to make about resource distribution, there was the signal. Cycling, not degraded, maintained. I kept returning, in the spaces between tasks, to the distinction that Kethan Vor had drawn. A record being kept for someone, not a message being sent. The difference, as he had described it, was in the structure, in the way the transmission was organized and addressed and patterned. A message has a recipient it is reaching toward. A record has a recipient it is waiting for. The transmission from the Serath interior was waiting for someone. It had been waiting for 400 years, and it was still waiting, and whoever it was waiting for had not yet come to collect it. 31st hour, the signal changed. It did not stop. The original cycling transmission, the Serath record, as I had begun to think of it, continued uninterrupted. But alongside it, on an adjacent frequency, there was a new signal. This one was tight beam. It was directed specifically at the vessel of continuing. It was in a language that was not Serath. It was in trade standard. Kethan Vor brought me the translation within 4 minutes of the signal's arrival. It was, as translations go, unambiguous. There were very few words, and they were not difficult words, and they did not require interpretation. The translation read, "You are approaching a protected zone. The Serath Collective has placed itself in voluntary suspension under the terms of the Warden Accord. Human space maintains wardenship of this zone under the same accord." We ask that you do not proceed further into the expanse interior. We ask that you do not attempt to contact or disturb the collective suspended systems. You are not in danger if you maintain your current course and exit corridor within the next 18 hours. We have noted your convoy designation and the nature of your passage. We understand you are in transit. You may proceed along the margin. Do not enter the interior. There was no threat in it. There was no anger in it. There was nothing in it that I could point to as hostile or intimidating. It was the tone of a statement rather than a warning. The tone of someone telling you where the edges of a room are, not to frighten you, because you are a guest in the house, and you deserve to know the layout. What made the hair on my neck rise was not the words. It was the sentence I could not stop reading. The one I went back to 4 times in the minute. After Kethan Vor handed me the translation. The Serath Collective has placed itself in voluntary suspension, not extinct, not dead, not lost, suspended, voluntarily, 400 years ago, by a civilization that had chosen, for reasons the transmission did not explain and I did not presume to know, to halt, to pause, close their eyes in a collective and deliberate act, and ask someone to hold the line until they chose to open them again. And the someone they had asked was human. I read the transmission again and again. I was looking for something in it that I could hold onto, some qualification, some conditional, some evidence that I was misreading the syntax, and the actual situation was something more manageable. I did not find it. The syntax was clean. The Warden Accord was the term the transmission used, and it used it without explanation, in the manner of a term that both parties were understood to already know. The way you reference an agreement with a counterpart who was party to the original negotiation. The humans had not been addressed as strangers to the situation. They had been addressed as parties to it. Old parties, who had been in place so long that the language of the accord had become the language of the place itself. I called the convoy council to the vessel of continuing's primary meeting chamber. The 11 council's members, the senior officers of the convoy's largest vessels, sat around the long table that served as our deliberation space, and I presented the translation and waited. The room was quiet for a long time. I had the translation up on the central display, trade standard text running beneath the Serath encoding's waveform that Kethan Vor had cleaned up and made visible for the purpose of making clear that this was not something we had authored or altered or misread through a faulty translation algorithm. The waveform sat there on the screen, cycling at the same interval it had been cycling since before we entered the margin corridor. The council members looked at it, and looked at the translation beneath it, and said nothing. Then Povin Ash was sitting 2 seats to my left, and who had been my second navigator since the beginning of the convoy, and who was not a person given to dramatic speech, said, very quietly, "They are still in there." I confirmed that this appeared to be the case, he said, "and the humans are." I said that was also what the transmission appeared to indicate. He was quiet for another moment. 400 years. I said yes. The council member from the agricultural ship, a Vesheri named Drev San, who managed 4,000 farmers and seedstock technicians, and who had spent most of the voyage thinking on soil chemistry and was not a strategist, said, "No one knew this? The conclave didn't know?" I said I could not be certain of what the conclave knew. I said that the expanse had been designated uncharted for 400 years, and that the designation had been maintained without revision across every administrative cycle in that. I said that the Serath Collective's extinction had been recorded as a historical fact in every navigational database I had ever consulted. I said I did not know whether the conclave's ignorance was genuine or whether it was something else. The council member from the ascending prow, the engineer who had been managing her drive irregularity for 2 months, and who was tired and tightly wound in the way that people get when they have been managing a problem too long, said, "Something else meaning what?" I said. Perhaps the Salaxy had decided, together and quietly and without announcement, that the arrangement was not its business, that, when the Serath Collective made their choice, and the humans took up the wardenship, the rest of the galaxy had looked at the situation and determined that it had nothing to offer and no standing to claim, and that the respectful response was to leave the margin well alone and chart it as dead space, and let the arrangement continue in whatever privacy the collective had asked. The council member from the ascending prow said, or the humans asked them to. I said that was also possible. No one had anything to add to that. The room had gotten very still in the way that rooms get still when everyone in them has understood something, and there is nothing left to argue about. The council was quiet for a while longer. Drev-san was looking at his hands. Two of the other council members were looking at the cycling waveform on the screen. Povanash was looking at me, which was what Povanash always did when he was waiting to see what I was going to decide. Then Povanash said, "We should do what they asked. We should continue along the margin and exit within the 18 hours. We should not enter the interior." There was general agreement on this. There was, I should say, immediate general agreement. The kind of agreement that forms when people are confronted with a situation that is well beyond their authority to involve themselves in, and they recognize this clearly and without ambiguity, and the desire to do the correct and respectful thing aligns perfectly with the desire to not be anywhere near the thing in question. We agreed. The convoy altered its configuration for the margin exit. I sent a communication to the other convoy vessels. The same information, tightly controlled, distributed only to the senior officers of each ship, and received back a series of affirmations that told me the other commanders had reached the same conclusion I had. We would proceed. We would exit. We would not speak of this broadly or immediately. The ascending prow did not follow. I noticed this at the 36th hour, which was 5 hours after the council meeting. The convoy was proceeding in correct formation along the margin corridor, drive settings aligned, interval spacing maintained. The ascending prow was not in the formation. She was not behind us. She was not ahead of us. Her position beacon, which she had been transmitting continuously since the convoy's departure from the Veshari home system, was gone from the network. Put the question to Kethan Vor, who checked every instrument we had, and then sat for a while in the particular stillness that meant he had found something he did not want to bring to me. He said, her last recorded position had her on a course that deviated from the margin corridor toward the interior. The course deviation had begun approximately 90 minutes after the council meeting, which meant approximately 90 minutes after the transmission had been distributed to her commanding officer. He did not know whether the course deviation was intentional or the result of the drive irregularity finally becoming unmanageable. The instruments could not tell him. Both explanations were consistent with what the data showed. I asked him whether there was any further contact from the ascending prow, any distress signal, any communication on any frequency. He said no. I asked him whether there was any change in the original Serath transmission or in the human tight beam frequency. He said no. I asked him whether there was any change in the Expanse sensor return, whether his instruments showed any activity, any anomaly, any indication of what might have happened to a vessel that had entered the interior. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Turn is the same as before. It shows me depth. It does not show me what is in the depth. I made the hardest decision I made in a long career of difficult decisions, and I ordered the convoy to maintain course and exit the margin." I thought, in the hours after I gave that order, about the commanding officer of the ascending prow. Her name was Veth Oren, and she was 62 years old, and she had served the outer ring administration of the Veshari government for 30 years, before the collapse. I had known her for 11 of those years. She was a careful person, not a timid person. There is a difference, careful in the specific way of someone who has been responsible for large vessels and large numbers of people for a long time, and has learned through experience that caution is not cowardice, but is in fact the most demanding form of professional discipline. She had managed the ascending prow's drive irregularity with what I can only describe as exemplary steadiness across 2 months of the convoy's most. I have never been able to decide whether what happened to the ascending prow was an accident or a choice. The drive irregularity gave the instruments something to point to. But the timing, 90 minutes after the council meeting, 90 minutes after Veth Oran had received the same translation I had read, sat with me for a long time, sits with me still. I do not know what she thought or decided in those 90 minutes. I do not know whether the drive took the ship or whether she took the ship into the drive's direction. I know only that she went in and that nothing came back. I have a theory, not a belief, a theory, the kind of thing you build over 60 years from inference and context and the specific texture of a decision you cannot verify, that the drive, irregularity was not the cause. That Vethoran read the transmission and understood something in it that the rest of us chose not to understand. That she read voluntary suspension and Warden Accord and 400 years and looked at the Ascensiprow's 143 people and looked at 60,000 Veshari in transit with no guaranteed destination and a resettlement corridor that might or might not materialize and thought about what it would mean to ask for sanctuary from someone who had been keeping promises for 4 centuries. I cannot know this. I never knew her well enough to say with confidence what she would have thought, and she is gone, and the interior gave nothing back. But I have thought about it for 60 years and I have not been able to dismiss it, and I am setting it down here as a theory rather than a claim, because the record deserves the honest shape of what I have and have not been able to conclude. We exited the margin corridor at the 44th hour. I held the convoy on the exit's threshold for 2 additional hours, running every long-range instrument I had on the Expanse eastern boundary, watching for the ascending prow. Nothing came back. 2 hours. I ordered the drive to full transit speed, and the convoy moved on toward the Rathani drift, and I went to my bunk for the first time. 37 hours and lay on my back in the dark and counted names. I did not know most of them. I knew Vethoran's. I counted it again at the end. What I need to tell you, and I understand that I am an old man with a failing lung, and that this is, by any reasonable measure, testimony that can be questioned on grounds of age, fatigue, grief, and the long compressing weight of a secret carried for 60 years, is what I understood in the hours after we left the margin. What I understood, and what I believe I have understood correctly, and what I am setting down now, because I am the last person alive who knows it, and because I cannot, in good conscience, take it with me. The Serath Collective chose to sleep. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I continue, because I think it is easy to hear that sentence and move past it toward the questions, the how and the why and the mechanics, without first staying with the simple fact of it. Of a civilization, millions of people, or however many the Serath were. I do not know their number. The historical record I had access to was thin, and the thin record listed their population only as substantial at the time of the recorded silence. A civilization of substantial population decided, at some point 400 years before my convoy crossed their margin, that they wanted to stop. Die. Stop. The distinction matters. Death is a conclusion. Suspension is a pause. They chose it. And then they chose someone to keep the pause for them. I have thought a great deal about that second choice. The choosing of a warden. You do not ask just anyone to hold a line for you while you sleep. You ask someone you trust. You ask someone who will still be there when you wake up. You ask someone who does not need anything from you in return for the watching. Someone whom the act of keeping the promise is itself sufficient. The Warden Accord. I do not know its terms. I have spent 60 years wishing I had some way to read its terms, and I have resigned myself to the likelihood that I will not. The Accord is presumably held in whatever archive exists in the human systems inside the Expanse's adjacent zones, and those zones are not places I have any standing to request documents from. But I know what the Accord requires in its simplest form. I know it because I watched it operating. 400 years of watching. One species holding a line, another species that could not watch for itself. Not as a duty in the sense of a burden imposed from outside. Not, I think, as an obligation in the sense of a debt. As a promise kept because a promise was made, and because the humans who are keeping it are, apparently, not species that set their promises down just because the one who asked it of them is asleep, and will not notice the difference. The galaxy knows about this. I am fairly certain of that now, in a way that I was not certain of it at the time of the crossing. I have had 60 years to look at the pattern from a distance, and the pattern is clear. Every species that borders the Expanse maintains its distance, not because the designation calls the zone uncharted, but because they know what the designation means. The Kelvari chart the expanse's spinward boundary, with a precision that suggests they know exactly where the boundary is not something you achieve through simple avoidance of unknown space. You achieve it through very deliberate charting, through the specific, careful work of knowing where a line is, and then stopping at that line every time, in every administrative cycle, across every generation of cartographers, for 400 years. The Jurassic escort arrangement fell apart in a manner that resulted, I now believe, in our convoy ending up in the margin corridor. Not because the Jurassic deliberately routed us there, exactly. Because the alternative routes they might have supported all led away from the expanse, and they were not going to help us navigate toward it. The Ethori, whose outer margin touches the expanse northern arc, have been maintaining their own border treaty with human space for longer than the Conclave has been keeping records of it. And the terms of that treaty include, if the rumors I have collected over 60 years of careful listening are accurate, an explicit provision that no Aethery vessel will approach the expanse margin without human clearance. The galaxy knows. The galaxy has known, I suspect, for the full 400 years. And the galaxy's made the same choice I made at the exit threshold. It has looked at the situation and decided that it has no standing, no authority, and no wisdom to offer on the subject. That the arrangement between the Serath Collective and the humans who keep their sleep is not the galaxy's business. That the correct response to being told, calmly and without hostility, that the interior is protected, and that you should proceed along the margin. An exit within 18 hours is to proceed along the margin and exit within 18 hours. That is not fear. I want to be precise about this, because I think the distinction matters for the record. What the galaxy has given the Serath Expanse is not the avoidance you extend to a predator or a weapon or a place that has demonstrated its capacity to harm you. It is something quieter and in some ways more profound. It is the avoidance you extend to a room where someone is sleeping, and to the one who is keeping watch, is the recognition that this arrangement is not yours to disturb, that the people inside, the ones sleeping, and the ones watching, made a covenant that did not include you, and that the covenant is working, and that the respectful response to a working covenant you were not party to is to leave it alone. The galaxy decided not to answer, not because it was afraid to answer, or not only because of that, or not primarily, but because the transmission was not addressed to the galaxy. It was addressed to the wardens, and the wardens answered, and the rest of the galaxy heard that answer and understood, the particular understanding that comes from having watched the humans operate across 4 centuries of keeping their word, that there was nothing left to say. I have spent a great deal of time thinking about what kind of species humans must be to have been asked this. To have been the ones the Serath Collective looked at the end of whatever long deliberation preceded their suspension, and decided were the right ones, the trustworthy ones, the ones who would still be there when the sleeping woke up. I have not met humans. I have encountered their work, once in a margin corridor at the edge of a sleeping civilization's boundary, and what their work looked like was a transmission that was calm and specific, and did not threaten or demand or perform. It stated facts. It named an agreement. It asked a thing, and then stated what would happen if the thing were done and what would happen if it were not. It was, in the phrasing of my people's oldest diplomatic tradition, the language of someone who has no need to make themselves larger than they are, because the situation already makes the case. I have tried to find in that transmission any indication of what the humans want in exchange for 400 years of wardenship, any fee, any territorial claim, any expansions of their own zone of influence in the margins all adjacent to the expanse. I have not found it. Either the terms of the Warden Ord Accord included payment that was made in full before the suspension began, or the humans asked for nothing. I do not know which of those is true. Both possibilities in their different ways are difficult to sit with. If they were paid in full before the suspension, if the Serath gave the humans something, territory or technology or knowledge, or some agreement I cannot imagine, in exchange for 4 centuries of wardenship, then the humans have delivered on the longest outstanding contract in recorded history. They have spent 400 years in faithful execution of a payment already received. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, an extraordinary thing. the keeping of a promise long after the circumstances that created it have become ancient history, and the other party to the promise is asleep and unable to verify compliance. You do not falsify a performance for a customer who cannot check your work. You do the work because you said you would do the work. If they asked for nothing, if the Serath said, "We need someone to watch over us while we sleep," and the humans said, "We will watch," and the humans have been watching for 400 years without asking anything back, then I do not have words for that in my own language. My language has a word for duty, a word for obligation, a word for covenant, a word for professional responsibility. It does not have a word for freely choosing to keep a promise to someone who is asleep for 4 centuries, without asking anything in return, simply because the promise was made, and you are the kind of species that keeps promises. I have come to believe, in my 81st year, that this is the reason the galaxy is quiet about the expanse. Not because the galaxy fears the humans, though I think the galaxy is also not. Without some healthy respect for what happens to vessels that enter the interior uninvited, as the ascending prow has demonstrated, if only to me and to 10 other people who will shortly all be dead. But because the galaxy looks at what the humans are doing in there and feels, correctly, that it is witnessing something it has no category for. A species that does not need to be observed in order to keep its word. A species that was trusted by another civilization with the most precious thing that civilization had. The sleep of its people, the continuation of its future, and that has treated that trust as an unconditional fact of its existence. Not as a burden, not as a source of power or influence. As a fact, they said they would watch. They are watching. The Serath transmission is still cycling, which means the collective is still asleep, which means the humans are still there. The galaxy chose not to answer the transmission because the transmission already had its answer. The humans answered it 400 years ago and have been answering it every day since. I am dictating this record to the Vesari Continuance Archives intake terminal. In the small office I have been given in the archive's eastern wing, where they take in accounts from elderly Veshari who have things to say about civil collapse or the convoy years or the resettlement or whatever else they have been carrying. The archivist who brought me here today, a young woman whose name I have already forgotten, is a symptom my physicians warned me about, told me that the archive has collected 12,000 such accounts and that the project is, and that no account is too small to matter to the record. I told her this account might be somewhat larger than the kind she normally receives. She smiled and set the recorder running and left me alone with it. I have been here for 2 hours. My lung is making itself known in the way it does in the afternoons. A pressure behind the sternum that is not yet pain but is a convincing rehearsal for it. I have perhaps 1 more hour of useful voice before I will need to stop for the day, and so I am going to close now and close cleanly, and say the things I want the record to contain. The Serath collective is not extinct. They are sleeping. They have been sleeping for 400 years. And they asked the humans to keep watch while they slept. And the humans have kept watch. I do not know when the Serath will wake. I do not know what the terms of their suspension were, whether they set a duration, whether they built in conditions for waking, whether the sleeping was meant to be permanent in a way that my word suspension is not quite capturing. I know only that the transmission is still cycling, which means the watch is still running, which means whatever the Serath chose for themselves is still in progress. I want the record to contain something else. When I read the human transmission in the 31st hour of the crossing, I read it 4 times. I have already said this. What I have not said to anyone in 60 years is what I felt in the reading, not fear. Not the professional alarm of a convoy commander confronted with a complication. Something else, something I have not been able to name to my own satisfaction. I think, if I am honest, it was grief. Grief for the ascending prow, which I had already begun to lose. Grief for the 143 people aboard her, whose names I did not know. Also, and this is the part I have not said, and the part that has stayed with me through 8 decades of living, grief for something I did not have a word for a world in which a civilization can sleep and trust that someone will be there when they wake. For a covenant kept in the dark, without witness, without payment, without acknowledgement, without anyone to observe whether the keepers were keeping it. The fact that such a thing exists in the galaxy, and that I had not known it, and that the galaxy had decided not to mention it, and that the not mentioning was itself a form of respect. I was a refugee. I had spent 6 months watching my civilization collapse behind me, and watching the formal structures that were supposed to support my convoy, the passage agreements, the escort arrangements, the provisionally authorized resettlement corridors, dissolve one by one in the acid of other people's political difficulties. I had watched obligation fail. I had watched promises fall apart. I had watched people do the calculation in which a promise to 60,000 desperate Veshari is weighed against a domestic political difficulty, and the promise comes up short every time. I had grown in those 6 months into a specific and well-earned cynicism about the keeping of agreements. A cynicism that I think was entirely reasonable given what I had witnessed, and that I think I would have carried to my grave, if not for the 31st hour of the crossing. And then, I read a transmission from a species I had never met, maintaining a covenant with a civilization that had been asleep for 400 years. Not know whether the covenant was being kept. I understand now why the galaxy is quiet about it. Because the galaxy has the same feeling I had. Because every species that has looked at what the humans are doing in the margins of the Serath Expanse has felt something in the looking that it does not quite have words for, and has decided, quietly without announcement, that the most honest response to witnessing something you do not have words for is to leave it alone and let it continue. Not to intrude, not to ask, not to offer help that was not requested, or oversight that was not authorized, or presence that was not invited, to simply go around the room where someone is sleeping, and let the one who is keeping watch keep it. The Serath transmission is still cycling. The collective is still asleep. The humans are still watching. I am the last person outside the human systems who knows this for certain rather than by implication, and I am going to die within the year. And after I am gone, the record will say what it says, and the galaxy will do what the galaxy does, which is decide whether to go on not answering. I think it will continue not to answer. I think it has decided that this is the right answer. That there is more honor in the silence than in the speaking. That the sleeping deserve their sleep, and the watchers deserve their vigil, and the rest. Us deserve, at the very minimum, the grace of knowing that such things are possibles. That a species can trust another species with the whole of future, and that the trust can be kept. The recorder is still running. I have nothing more to say that the record needs to hold. I have said the facts, the convoy, the corridor, the transmission, the response, the ascending prow. I have said what I understood from those facts. I have said what I felt. I have said what I believe. What I believe, at the end of 81 years and 60 years of silence, is this. The Serath Collective did not choose their wardens at random. They chose them because they had watched, and what they had seen when they watched was a species that understood, at some level, that the galaxy's formal administrative structures had not yet developed vocabulary for what it meant to be responsible for something that could not speak for itself. The humans had seen something in the Serath situation. Their need, their vulnerability, the specific form of trust that the sleeping require from the waking, and the humans had said yes. Not for payment, not for territory. The reason you say yes when someone asks you to keep watch over them while they cannot watch themselves. Because they asked. Because you are the kind of species that says yes to that. Let it run. There is one more thing I want to set down before the recorder stops. Shh. I want to set it down carefully, because it is the thing I have been most uncertain about over 60 years and the thing I most want to get right. The night after we exited the margin, the night I lay in my bunk in the dark, counting names, I did something I had not done in a long time. I went back to the vessel of Continuing's navigational archive, and I pulled every piece of documentation we carried on the Serath Collective. There was not much. The Conclave's historical registry gave me 14 pages, which was 3 pages more than the navigational briefing had cited, and 11 pages less than I wanted. The 14 pages told me the following: that the Serath had been a Type 3 civilization by the Orvith scale, interstellar, multiple inhabited systems, substantial technological development. that they had been present in the Expanse's interior for approximately 3,000 years before the recorded silence, that the recorded silence had occurred across a period of approximately 7 years rather than suddenly, and that the conclave had designated the Expanse uncharted 3 years after the last confirmed Serath transmission. 14 pages did not tell me why they had chosen to suspend. They did not tell me whether the choice had been unanimous or contested or forced circumstance. They did not tell me what the Serath had been like, what they had built, what they had believed, what they had loved. The historical record of a species the galaxy had quietly agreed to forget is a thin document. I sat with those 14 pages for a long time, turning them over in my hands, looking for the shape of a civilization in the gaps between the data points, and I did not find it. What I found instead was this: the recorded silence had lasted 7 years. The conclave had designated the Expanse uncharted 3 years after the last confirmed Serath transmission, which meant that between the last confirmed transmissions and the conclave's designation, there had been 4 years in which the Serath had still been transmitting. But what they had been transmitting had not been recorded as a Serath signal by the conclave's monitoring systems. I read that gap 3 times before I understood what it meant. The Serath had transmitted for 4 years after the conclave stopped recognizing their transmissions. They had sent the cycling record, the one we received in the margin corridor, the one addressed to the wardens, for 4 years, in a format that either the conclave's monitoring systems could not resolve, or that the conclave had chosen to file as environmental noise. And somewhere in those 4 years the humans had heard it, had understood it, had said yes. I do not know when the Warden Accord was signed. I do not know whether it was signed before or after the suspension began. I do not know whether the humans had been in contact with the Serath before the decision to suspend, whether they had been friends, allies, trading partners, or strangers who had simply been paying attention when everyone else had stopped listening. I do not know how a civilization communicates the terms of a wardenship for a voluntary suspension to a species that has agreed to keep it. What I know is that 4 years after the conclave stopped recognizing the Serath's transmissions, the cycling record was in place, which means that within 4 years of the Serath deciding to sleep, the arrangement had been made. The humans had been found, or had been approached, or had come forward. And the record had been set cycling in a format that the wardens could receive, and had been maintained at full signal integrity for 400 years since. 400 years. Not 4 years, not 40, not a generation. 4 centuries of a watch kept in the margin of a sleeping civilization's border. In a sector the rest of the galaxy had agreed to call empty. I put the 14 pages back in the archive, and I did not pull them out again. There is nothing in those pages that changes the facts of the crossing. There is nothing in them that changes what I decided at the exit threshold, or what I have lived with since. But I wanted to look at the record. The official record, the thin record, the record the galaxy had agreed to maintain in lieu of the fuller accounting, and set it against what I knew, and let the gap between them speak for itself. The gap says, the galaxy agreed to call the Serath extinct, and the Serath are not extinct. The galaxy agreed to call the Expanse uncharted, and the Expanse is not uncharted. It is held, tended, monitored by species that does not need the galaxy's validation to know what it agreed to do. The gap between the official record and the operational reality is 400 years wide and maintained at full signal integrity. That is what the humans are. They are the gap between what the galaxy agreed to remember and what is actually true. The recorder is still running. Let it run.